In the tense arena of U.S. China relations, talk of a grand bargain persists. A sweeping deal between President Trump and President Xi that could reset the global order. The idea is seductive. Two leaders, one summit, and a handshake that ends trade wars and strategic rivalry. Trump's transactional approach and Xi's openness to negotiation fuel this hope, even as tensions escalate across economic, technological, and military fronts. A grand bargain promises stability, but history tells a different story. Cycles of conflict and cooperation, shaped by shifting geopolitics and domestic pressures, have always defined this relationship. Today, the internal politics of both nations make such sweeping compromise nearly impossible. U.S.-China relations have always swung between cooperation and confrontation, driven by changing geopolitics and domestic politics. Real breakthroughs only happened when both faced a common enemy, like the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Nixon's visit to China wasn't about shared values, but about countering Moscow. Economic cooperation too only flourished when both countries' politics favored globalization. But true partnership, security and economic, has always been elusive. Today, with nationalism on the rise and no shared threat, the two are more likely to clash than cooperate. The odds of a grand bargain have never been slimmer. When the U.S. and China lack a common enemy, relations sour. History proves it. After 1949, China became the face of global communism for Americans, fueling Cold War hostilities. The Korean War cemented mutual suspicion, and the rivalry spread across the developing world. Domestic politics reinforced this divide. The U.S. isolated China economically, while Mao's China shunned global trade in favor of self-reliance. Both nations existed in separate economic spheres, deepening their political and military rivalry. Without shared interests, confrontation became the norm. The pattern: no common enemy, no cooperation. For decades, the U.S. and China used each other as political scapegoats, rallying domestic support by demonizing the other. This hardened mistrust and empowered hardliners on both sides. But by the early 1970s, the game changed. China's split with the Soviet Union and America's Vietnam quagmire created new incentives. Beijing saw the U.S. as a counterweight to Moscow. Washington saw an opening to contain the Soviets and exit Vietnam. The result: secret diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the first real thaw in U.S.-China relations. Both sides recognized the value of partnership, at least temporarily. Strategic interests, not ideology, drove this pivot. The lesson: external threats can override even the deepest divides. Nixon's 1972 visit to China launched a tacit alliance against the Soviets, pragmatic, not ideological. Diplomatic ties warmed, but economic cooperation lagged. China's economy remained closed and centrally planned. Even after Mao, China clung to state-led development, limiting trade with the U.S. The real breakthrough came in the 1980s when both nations embraced market reforms and globalization. Deng Xiaoping's reforms opened China to the world, while Reagan's America championed free trade. For a brief moment, security and economic interests aligned. This rare convergence fueled unprecedented cooperation. But history shows such alignment is fleeting and always vulnerable to shifting politics. The strategic logic underpinning the U.S.-China rapprochement in the 1970s was, honestly, powerfully reinforced throughout the 1980s by the continued presence of a common adversary, the Soviet Union. This shared threat acted as the essential glue holding the relationship together, really allowing both Washington and Beijing to overlook their significant ideological and political differences in favor of a mutually beneficial partnership. Collaboration between the two nations reached new heights during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which began in late 1979. This event provided a clear and tangible focus for their joint efforts, transforming their tacit alliance into a more active and coordinated campaign to bleed Moscow's resources and undermine its global standing. A campaign that would last for the entire decade. This period, in fact, saw unprecedented cooperation, especially in the realm of covert action. The United States and China collaborated extensively in arming and training the Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen. This joint effort was one of the most significant covert operations of the Cold War, funneling weapons, funding, and logistical support to the rebels fighting the Soviet occupation. This practical, on-the-ground partnership did more than just bog down the Soviet military. It also served to further strengthen the U.S.-Chinese security relationship, building a level of trust and operational familiarity that had been unimaginable just a decade prior. This shared mission really defined their strategic interactions throughout the Reagan years. The emergence of pro-globalization political coalitions in both countries during this same period, combined with the persistent threat from their common enemy, created an exceptionally conducive environment for both economic and strategic cooperation to flourish. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan's administration was a vocal champion of free markets and international trade, viewing economic engagement as a tool to promote prosperity and, honestly, to combat communism. His policies of deregulation and trade liberalization found a surprisingly receptive partner in Deng Xiaoping's China, which was embarking on its own ambitious journey of reform and opening up, moving away from Maoist orthodoxy toward a more market-driven economic model. This unique alignment of factors, a shared strategic foe and parallel domestic shifts toward economic liberalization, created what can, in retrospect, be seen as a golden era in U.S.-China relations. It was a rare moment when the geopolitical and economic interests of the two powers weren't in conflict, but were in fact mutually reinforcing. The strategic imperative to contain the Soviet Union provided the political cover and motivation for deepening economic ties, while the growing commercial relationship added another layer of stability and mutual benefit to the strategic partnership. This delicate but powerful synergy would, in a way, define their interactions until the very end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was, honestly, a world-altering event that fundamentally changed the strategic calculus for both the United States and China. With their common enemy suddenly gone from the geopolitical chessboard, the primary strategic rationale for their security cooperation all but disappeared overnight. The very foundation of their tacit alliance had been the shared threat from Moscow. Without it, the underlying differences and latent rivalries between the two powers began to surface with renewed intensity. While the economic relationship that had blossomed in the 1980s continued to flourish, driven by its own powerful momentum, the strategic partnership that had enabled it began to fray almost immediately in the new, post-Cold War world. In Washington, the disappearance of the Soviet threat led to a significant reassessment of China's role in the world. No longer viewed primarily as a strategic partner against a common foe, Beijing's growing economic and military power began to be seen in a different light. Concerns mounted within the U.S. foreign policy and defense establishments about the long-term implications of a rising China. Questions were raised about the credibility of the United States' forward military presence in Asia and its ability to uphold its security commitments to allies in the region. China's increasing willingness to push back against perceived encroachments on its core interests, particularly concerning Taiwan and the South China Sea, further fueled these anxieties in Washington. The 1995-96 crisis in the Taiwan Strait served as a dramatic illustration of these emerging tensions and significantly raised the stakes of the new rivalry. In response to what it viewed as moves by Taiwan toward formal independence, including a visit by the Taiwanese president to the United States, Beijing launched a series of provocative military exercises. This included firing a series of ballistic missiles into the waters near major Taiwanese ports, a clear and aggressive act of intimidation designed to warn both Taipei and Washington. This crisis brought the two nuclear-armed powers dangerously close to a direct military confrontation, really highlighting the new fault lines in their relationship. Faced with this overt display of Chinese assertiveness, the United States responded decisively to demonstrate its military commitment to Taiwan and its role as the ultimate guarantor of regional stability. The Clinton administration dispatched multiple aircraft carrier battle groups to the region, a powerful show of force intended to signal to Beijing that the United States would not tolerate the use of military coercion against the democratic island. This incident marked a turning point, crystallizing the shift from a cooperative to a competitive strategic relationship. The era of shared purpose was definitively over, replaced by a new dynamic of strategic mistrust and potential conflict that would shape their interactions for decades to come. With only economic interests remaining in alignment after the Cold War, the relationship between Beijing and Washington became, well, increasingly complex and plagued by mixed motives. Leaders in both capitals found themselves navigating a maze of conflicting pressures, compelled to cooperate on economic matters while simultaneously competing for strategic influence. U.S. President Bill Clinton, a strong proponent of globalization, devised a new rationale for continued engagement that he believed could one day lead to a renewed strategic alignment. His policy of comprehensive engagement was predicated on the idea that free trade and foreign investment could be used as powerful tools to integrate China into the US-led global order, making it a responsible stakeholder. The core assumption of this strategy was that economic liberalization would inevitably lead to political liberalization within China. By tethering China's prosperity to the global economic system, Clinton and his advisors hoped to encourage internal reforms that would make China more democratic, more transparent, and ultimately, a more cooperative partner on the world stage. On the other side of the Pacific, Deng Xiaoping's successor, Jiang Zemin, appeared willing to play along. He continued and deepened the reformist policies initiated by Deng, recognizing that access to American markets, technology, and capital was essential for China's continued economic development and modernization. This mutual interest in economic engagement set the stage for a decade of deepening ties. The net result of this policy was a spectacular and unprecedented expansion in U.S.-China trade throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. The bilateral trade volume exploded, creating deep and intricate connections between the two economies. This period also saw the start of difficult but ultimately successful negotiations that culminated in China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. This landmark event was hailed at the time as the final step in integrating China fully into the global economic architecture, a move that supporters believed would bind China to international rules and norms, thereby ensuring a more peaceful and prosperous future for all. Consequently, the U.S. and Chinese economies have been deeply intertwined ever since, creating a complex web of mutual dependence. Chinese manufacturing became the workshop of the world, supplying affordable goods to American consumers, while China, in turn, became a critical market for American companies, and a major holder of U.S. government debt. However, this very interdependence, which was once seen as a source of stability, would eventually become a source of friction and vulnerability. The hope that economic integration would automatically resolve strategic differences proved to be overly optimistic, as the underlying security competition continued to simmer just beneath the surface of the thriving commercial relationship. Last year, the economic relationship between China and the United States remained massive in scale, with the two countries trading over $580 billion in goods and services. For the United States, China stands as its third largest trade partner, a critical link in global supply chains for countless American industries. Conversely, the United States represents China's largest single export market, not counting regional blocs like ASEAN or the European Union, making American consumers essential to the health of the Chinese economy. Furthermore, Beijing's significant holdings of over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities underscore a deep financial codependency. This intricate web of mutual economic reliance, however, masks deeper centrifugal forces that have been steadily and powerfully pulling the two countries apart for years. Beneath the surface of these staggering trade figures, a profound shift has been taking place. Domestically, leaders in both America and China are facing mounting political pressure to turn inward and pivot away from global markets. This pressure stems from a remarkably similar source in both nations: the widespread public perception that globalization, while enriching a select few, has caused significant inequality and social dislocation for the many. In both countries, a growing segment of the population feels left behind by the global economic system, leading to a powerful political backlash against the very principles of free trade and open markets that once defined the relationship. In the United States, the economic dislocation precipitated and accelerated by globalization has fueled a growing and vocal backlash against free trade agreements and international institutions. The early warning signs of this discontent were evident as far back as the 1990s, with the contentious political battle over President Clinton's North American Free Trade Agreement and the disruptive protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle. These events were precursors to a much broader populist movement that would eventually reshape the American political landscape, challenging the long-standing bipartisan consensus in favor of economic openness and global integration. However, it was not until the devastating global financial crash of 2008 and the subsequent slow recovery during the Obama administration that domestic anxieties about job losses and China's perceived unfair trade practices became explosive, hot-button electoral issues. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers from both parties increasingly began to link the United States' economic troubles directly to China's emergence as an economic powerhouse. They pointed to currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, and state subsidies as key factors disadvantaging American workers. It was a short and politically expedient step from this narrative to the fiercely anti-Chinese, America First neo-mercantilist agenda that Donald Trump championed on the campaign trail and later implemented from the Oval Office. At the same time that anti-globalization sentiment was rising in the United States, parallel developments were afoot in China, reshaping its domestic priorities and its posture toward the outside world. This shift began subtly under the leadership of Hu Jintao in the first decade of the 21st century, but accelerated dramatically under Xi Jinping in the 2010s. Under Xi, China pivoted toward a more assertive and confident nationalism, coupled with an inwardly focused policy agenda designed to address the country's own internal challenges. This new direction marked a significant departure from the previous era's single-minded focus on export-led growth and integration into the global economy at any cost. President Xi emphasized ambitious new goals like common prosperity and social equity, aiming to reduce the vast wealth gap that had emerged during decades of rapid growth. He also prioritized the green transition and, most significantly, the China Dream. This powerful national narrative promised rising living standards for the Chinese people, but also a better overall quality of life, a powerful and confident China on the world stage, and a more consumer-oriented economy focused on mastering leading-edge technologies. Achieving these domestic goals required a fundamental rebalancing of the Chinese economy, a process that inherently involved a change in its relationship with the rest of the world. These strategic moves entailed a deliberate policy of reducing China's reliance on foreign technology and investment, which Beijing increasingly saw as a source of strategic vulnerability. The new focus was on increasing domestic demand to power the economy, fostering indigenous innovation to climb the technology ladder, and reasserting the primacy of the state over the market in key strategic sectors. This turn inward was also fueled by growing fears within the Communist Party that the United States was winning the hearts and minds of young Chinese through cultural and economic influence. Consequently, Beijing increasingly began to blame Washington for its own domestic economic and social problems, framing external forces as a threat to China's stability. With each country's political leadership actively scapegoating the other for its internal woes, and with no common enemy to create a compelling incentive to cooperate, the political space for alignment on strategic and military matters narrowed precipitously. The foundational trust required for such cooperation eroded, replaced by mutual suspicion and a competitive mindset. The economic interdependence that was once thought to be a ballast for the relationship was now being reinterpreted through a security lens. This growing mistrust made it nearly impossible to find common ground, even on issues that posed a threat to both nations, setting the stage for a more confrontational era. During the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, there were, a bunch of attempts to find new areas of common ground that could, hopefully, substitute for the old Soviet threat and anchor the United States-China relationship. Policymakers on both sides were hoping that by cooperating on non-traditional security challenges, like global terrorism, climate change, and public health pandemics, they could create a new strategic rationale for partnership. But honestly, these efforts mostly foundered. They just couldn't overcome the growing strategic rivalry and, the domestic political pressures that were pulling the two powers apart. The fundamental disconnect between their core national priorities turned out to be just too great a barrier for any kind of sustained and meaningful cooperation. For Washington, the main security concern in the first decade of the century was fighting a so-called global war on terror after the September 11th attacks. The United States really wanted China's cooperation in this effort, hoping to build a broad international coalition. But Beijing was much more focused on its own immediate neighborhood, especially developments in East Asia, like managing the Korean Peninsula and asserting its claims in the South China Sea. While China did, pay lip service to counterterrorism, its definition and priorities were vastly different from those of Washington, which led to a shallow and honestly, pretty transactional level of cooperation that just didn't build any real strategic trust. Later on, joint U.S. Chinese efforts to cooperate on the critical issue of climate change also got tangled up in their broader disputes over trade, technology, government subsidies, and the whole question of protecting intellectual property. Even though both sides recognized the existential threat posed by a warming planet, and they did manage to produce a landmark joint announcement before the 2015 Paris Agreement, this cooperation was, at best, fragile. It just couldn't be insulated from the deep-seated economic grievances and technological competition that defined the relationship. Each side suspected the other of using climate policy as a tool to gain an economic edge, which really undermined the potential for a genuine partnership. By 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, a global health crisis that should have been a catalyst for, unprecedented international cooperation, instead exposed and, honestly, dramatically exacerbated these confrontational tendencies. In the United States, political leaders led by President Trump openly criticized China for its initial handling of the outbreak, labeling the disease the China virus and fueling conspiracy theories about its origin. In response, China forcefully rejected these accusations and launched a global propaganda campaign, portraying its authoritarian pandemic response as superior to what it saw as the chaotic efforts in Western democracies. Later, China used vaccine diplomacy not as a tool for global good, but as yet another arena to compete with the United States and boost its own global image. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't create the rivalry between the United States and China, but it really did pour gasoline on a fire that was already burning. The global crisis acted as an accelerant, intensifying the economic nationalism that had been, steadily growing in both countries. As the virus spread across the globe, disrupting lives and economies everywhere, it laid bare the vulnerabilities of long, complex international supply chains. Suddenly, nations found themselves unable to get essential goods like personal protective equipment and medical supplies, much of which was produced in China. This realization triggered a powerful political imperative in both Washington and Beijing to secure critical supply chains domestically, reducing their dependence on foreign countries for essential goods. And this drive for self-sufficiency didn't stop at medical supplies. During the presidency of Joe Biden, the focus broadened to restricting access to key strategic materials, and most importantly, leading-edge technologies. The United States, seeing China's technological ambitions as a direct threat to its long-term national security and economic competitiveness, put in place a series of stringent export controls. These measures were designed to choke off China's access to advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment, stuff that's absolutely necessary for powering high-tech industries, from artificial intelligence to 5G communications. It was a clear signal that the era of open technological exchange was over, replaced by an era of, fierce technological containment. As strategic mistrust deepened during the Biden years, both Washington and Beijing started to view nearly every action by the other through the hostile lens of great power rivalry. Things that might have once seemed like ordinary commercial transactions or just standard policy decisions were now interpreted as calculated moves in a much larger geopolitical chess match. The fundamental assumption on both sides shifted, from one of potential cooperation to one of inherent competition and threat. This pervasive suspicion poisoned the atmosphere for diplomacy, making it honestly really difficult to address even common challenges, since each side worried that any concession would just be exploited by the other for strategic gain. This shift in perception fundamentally changed the nature of their economic relationship. Economic statecraft could no longer be the same kind of clear-cut battleground it was back in the 1950s and 60s, when China and the United States operated in almost entirely separate trading spheres with minimal contact. Their deep and intricate interdependence built up over decades made a complete decoupling impossible without causing catastrophic damage to their own economies. This mutual dependence meant a much subtler and more complex dance of competition, but it also opened up entirely new avenues for rivalry and new angles of leverage that, honestly, were just unthinkable during the height of the Cold War. The new era of competition saw both the United States and China increasingly try to weaponize different aspects of their deep interdependence. This marked a dangerous new phase in their relationship, where the very ties that once bound them together were now turning into potential instruments of coercion. In a clear tit-for-tat escalation, the United States imposed stringent export controls on advanced microchips, aiming to cripple China's technological progress. In response, China leveraged its own dominance in a different critical sector, imposing export restrictions on rare earth minerals. These are essential components for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced defense systems used by the American military. This economic warfare extended into other domains as well. Threats started to surface over the vast sums of publicly held debt. Some American politicians even floated the idea of defaulting on the more than $1 trillion in United States Treasury securities held by Beijing, an extreme measure that would have profound consequences for the global financial system. Similarly, state-directed investment flows were now viewed with deep suspicion. Both countries began to screen and block foreign investments in critical sectors, effectively turning capital flows into yet another front in their escalating rivalry. Although both sides publicly recognize the danger of letting this rivalry spiral into open military conflict, the relationship remains exceptionally volatile and fundamentally unstable. The lack of reliable communication channels and erosion of mutual trust have created a precarious situation, one where a miscalculation could quickly escalate into a major crisis. The flashpoints for potential conflict are numerous, from the contested waters of the South China Sea to tensions over a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The risk of an unintended clash between these nuclear-armed powers is higher now than at any point in recent decades. 6 months into the new Trump administration, relations have only gotten more precarious. President Trump's signature tactic of using overwhelming economic pressure was once again put on display. In April, his administration imposed over-the-top tariffs on Chinese goods, jacking them up to an eye-popping 145%. This move was meant to be a kind of shock therapy, designed to force President Xi to the negotiating table and pave the way for the grand bargain Trump has long wanted. However, the immediate Chinese response suggests that such blunt tactics are unlikely to succeed in the current political climate. The Chinese leader's reaction to the new American tariffs was, well, swift, forceful, and symmetrical, showing that Beijing would not be easily intimidated. President Xi immediately raised tariffs on United States goods to 125%, hitting American farmers and manufacturers pretty hard. But more strategically, he imposed new export restrictions on critical rare earth minerals and the powerful magnets made from them, directly targeting a key vulnerability in American high-tech and defense supply chains. This decisive countermove sent a clear message. China was prepared to absorb economic pain and would not be coerced into a deal that compromised its core interests. The quick escalation really showed that bullying tactics were more likely to produce conflict than concessions. In the standoff that followed, although both sides eventually agreed to a temporary trade truce to de-escalate the immediate crisis, it was arguably Trump, not Xi, who blinked first by agreeing to pause further tariff hikes without securing any major upfront concessions from China. This dynamic reveals the fundamental problem at the heart of any potential grand bargain. The core demands of each side are seen as existential threats by the other. Short of President Trump making major politically untenable concessions on issues critical to Xi's geopolitical ambitions, like Taiwan or the South China Sea, the Chinese leader is extremely unlikely to cave to American demands on trade and other economic matters. Herein lies the central, intractable rub of the current United States-China predicament. Any grand bargain that could realistically be struck under these conditions would almost certainly require the United States to implicitly recognize much of East and Southeast Asia as a de facto Chinese sphere of influence. That would be the price for securing economic concessions from Beijing. In return, China might offer a similar recognition of a United States sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic, and Oceania. Such a deal might appeal to a transactional America First worldview, but it would come at a catastrophic strategic cost for the United States and its allies. A monumental deal like this would seriously compromise the security of core United States allies in the region, particularly Japan and the Philippines, who rely on American security guarantees to counterbalance a rising China. A United States retreat from its long-standing commitments could very well drive these and other Asian nations to consider drastic options to guarantee their own security, including the once unthinkable step of acquiring their own nuclear weapons. This, honestly, is a classic recipe for what international relations scholars call a perilous security dilemma, where one country's effort to increase its security inadvertently threatens others, setting in motion a dangerous cycle of mistrust, arms races, and potential conflict. A grand bargain that trades geopolitical influence for economic stability would be a Faustian one for the United States, setting a deeply dangerous precedent for global alliance politics and nuclear non-proliferation norms. The erosion of trust in the United States among its key allies would be immediate and profound. If Washington is seen as willing to sacrifice the security interests of long-standing partners like Japan, South Korea, or the Philippines for the sake of a trade deal, the very foundation of America's global alliance system would crumble. This would make any future coalition-building efforts vastly more difficult, significantly weakening the United States' strategic posture not just in the Indo-Pacific but across the entire world, leaving it more isolated and less secure. This potential unraveling of the security architecture that has underpinned regional stability for decades would have far-reaching consequences. The strategic costs to the United States of conceding influence in the region to China would far outweigh any potential short-term economic benefits, including increased access to the vast Chinese market, or even a politically popular resurgence in American manufacturing. The stability and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region, which is vital to global trade and American economic interests, depends heavily on the credibility of U.S. security commitments. Abandoning these commitments would create a power vacuum that China would eagerly fill, leading to a more volatile and conflict-prone region. This scenario would create what international relations scholars term a perilous security dilemma. As U.S. allies lose faith in American protection, they would be forced to take matters into their own hands. This could trigger a regional arms race as countries like Japan, South Korea, and even Taiwan might feel compelled to develop their own independent military capabilities, including the acquisition of nuclear weapons, to deter Chinese aggression. Such a development would shatter the global non-proliferation regime and dramatically increase the risk of nuclear conflict in one of the world's most economically vital and strategically contested regions, creating a nightmare scenario for global stability. Ultimately, a grand bargain built on such concessions would put in motion a vicious cycle of mistrust and potential conflict that would be incredibly difficult to reverse. Each country's effort to increase its own security in the wake of a U.S. withdrawal would be perceived as a threat by its neighbors, escalating tensions across the board. The very act of seeking a grand bargain to reduce conflict would, paradoxically, sow the seeds of a much larger and more dangerous confrontation down the line. The pursuit of a seemingly simple top-down solution would ignore the complex, interwoven security dependencies that have, for all their flaws, maintained a precarious peace for decades. An often discussed economic component of a potential grand bargain presents its own set of perilous illusions. Such a deal would likely involve President Trump rolling back the steep U.S. tariffs, easing the stringent export controls on advanced technology, and allowing renewed Chinese investments in key U.S. sectors. In return, President Xi would agree to relax China's export restrictions on rare earth minerals and finally take concrete steps to curb the anti-competitive state-led policies, including massive industrial subsidies and rampant intellectual property theft, that have long disadvantaged American businesses and workers. This quid pro quo seems balanced on the surface, but it fails to address the underlying sources of economic discontent. Such an agreement would undoubtedly offer something that key domestic economic sectors on both sides desperately want. American farmers and manufacturers would celebrate the removal of retaliatory Chinese tariffs, while China's tech giants would welcome the restored access to American components and investment. However, a deal of this nature would do very little to address the deeper structural issues that are currently whipsawing both economies. For millions of ordinary citizens in both countries, the primary concerns are not tariff levels, but falling real wages, rising prices for essential goods, and a precarious job market. A high-level deal focused on corporate interests would likely fail to provide them with any tangible relief. Any agreement that fails to deliver tangible and immediate economic gains for the broader population is likely to backfire politically. Instead of calming domestic anxieties, it would probably fuel even stronger demands for protectionism and a deeper trepidation about the perceived harms of globalization. The public would see it as a deal made by elites, for elites, confirming their suspicions that the system is rigged against them. This could strengthen the appeal of more extreme, nationalist and xenophobic political movements in both countries, further poisoning the well for any future international cooperation, and deepening the sense of mutual distrust and animosity between the two peoples. Therefore, To better serve long-term U.S. interests, the Trump administration would be wise to recalibrate its ambitious deal-making aspirations. Instead of chasing an all-encompassing but ultimately dangerous grand bargain, the focus should shift to narrower, yet strategically significant and more achievable objectives. Chief among these goals should be the urgent task of preventing an accidental conflict in flashpoint areas like the South China Sea. This requires a focus not on grand pronouncements, but on the painstaking work of building more reliable communication channels, restarting consistent military-to-military dialogues, and establishing practical confidence-building measures to manage the intense rivalry responsibly. To better serve U.S. interests in this complex and volatile environment, President Trump would be wise to recalibrate his deal-making ambitions, moving away from the alluring but perilous fantasy of a grand bargain. The focus should instead shift toward narrower, yet more strategically significant and realistically winnable objectives. Chief among these priorities must be the prevention of accidental conflict, particularly in volatile flashpoints like the South China Sea. This requires a pragmatic approach centered on building more reliable and resilient communication channels between the two militaries. Consistent military-to-military dialogues are essential for reducing misperceptions and managing unexpected encounters between naval and air forces operating in close proximity, ensuring a single miscalculation does not spiral into a major crisis. Beyond just talking, the two sides should focus on implementing concrete confidence-building measures designed to increase transparency and reduce the risk of surprise. This could include establishing pre-launch notification procedures for space launches, which can often be misconstrued as ballistic missile tests, thereby preventing unnecessary escalations. Similarly, developing clear processes for dealing in real time with the growing threats of cyber warfare and state-sponsored hacking is crucial. These are not headline-grabbing achievements, but they are the essential nuts and bolts of responsible great power management. Such initiatives would not only lower the likelihood of a catastrophic escalation, but also provide tangible reassurance to allies in Asia of the United States' unwavering commitment to regional peace and security. Through a series of small, incremental agreements, President Trump and President Xi could begin to rebuild a modicum of stability in the relationship. They could, for instance, address specific issues like maritime security and freedom of navigation by agreeing to a binding code of conduct for their naval vessels, along with clear protocols for managing close-in encounters at sea. This would build upon existing, but often ignored agreements and create a more predictable environment in contested waters. In the cyber domain, the two leaders could work to establish and enforce clear norms against state-sponsored commercial cyber theft and attacks on critical infrastructure, creating red lines that both sides agree not to cross. This patient, step-by-step approach offers a stark contrast to the high-risk, all-or-nothing gamble of a grand bargain. It recognizes that in an era of deep strategic mistrust, progress is more likely to be achieved through a series of small, verifiable steps that build trust over time rather than through a single sweeping agreement. A small but real step back from the brink of conflict would be a far grander achievement than a hollow and dangerous deal. It is a less glamorous but far more prudent path that prioritizes the long-term stability of the relationship and the security of the United States and its allies over the fleeting appeal of a historic photo opportunity. Similarly, achieving measured progress on the economic front first requires a fundamental reset of expectations. Instead of seeking a comprehensive deal that promises to solve all economic grievances at once, the initial goal should be to establish some sort of shared framework that can deliver predictability and stability to the terms of trade. This means moving away from the chaotic cycle of sudden, massive tariff hikes and retaliatory measures that has defined the relationship recently. A basic agreement to cap tariffs and create a more transparent regulatory environment would provide a much-needed foundation of stability, allowing businesses on both sides to plan and invest with greater certainty about the future. This framework would not resolve the deep-seated issues of intellectual property theft or state subsidies overnight. However, it would create a more conducive atmosphere for tackling these complex problems over the long term. By de-escalating the immediate trade war, both sides can create the political space needed for more detailed negotiations on specific sectors and issues. This incremental approach allows for small victories that can build momentum for addressing more contentious topics down the road. It is a strategy of managing competition responsibly, rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely. which is an unrealistic goal given the current political realities in both nations. Ultimately, the fantasy of a grand bargain is a distraction from the real and difficult work that needs to be done. The current conditions, deep-seated nationalism in both countries, the absence of a common enemy, and profound strategic mistrust, make a comprehensive settlement impossible. Chasing such a deal is not just futile, it is dangerous. It risks forcing the United States into making catastrophic concessions that would undermine its security and alienate its allies, all for the sake of an economic truce that would likely prove to be fleeting and politically unsustainable. The allure of a quick fix must be resisted in favor of a more patient and strategic approach. The smarter path forward for American policymakers is to focus on manageable, critical goals that reduce risk and enhance stability. This means prioritizing crisis management mechanisms, establishing clear red lines, and seeking modest, incremental progress on specific economic disputes. A small but real step back from the brink, achieved through careful and persistent diplomacy, would be a truly grand accomplishment. In the fraught relationship between today's great powers, recognizing the limits of what is possible is the first step toward achieving what is necessary. Deadlock may be more likely than détente, but diligent management can prevent deadlock from escalating into disaster.